This episode is The Waiting Room: How to Function When Layoffs Are Circling. You've heard the rumors. Maybe it was a comment someone made at the end of a meeting that lingered a bit too long. Maybe you saw the calendar invite that went out to certain people and not you. Maybe the reorg announcement came down, the one written in that careful corporate language designed to say everything and nothing at the same time. Or maybe you read it in a trade publication before your own leadership said a word. And now you are waiting. You're showing up to work, physically or on Zoom, doing the job, attending the meetings, responding to the Slacks, and underneath all of it, there is a low grade hum that won't quit. That persistent background anxiety that something is coming. You just don't know when or whether it's aimed at you. That's what we're talking about today. I'm Rich Jones. This is Living Without an Expiration Date, a show for experienced professionals navigating the stretch between too experienced to be easily hired and not ready to stop contributing. We don't do pep talks here. We don't do lists. What we do is sit with the real experience of what it means to be a professional in the second half of a career and try to think clearly about it together. In today's episode, the anxiety of a pending layoff is one I know intimately, not just as a career coach, not just from the people I've worked with, but personally. I've been in that room. I've been the person trying to keep my head down and my game face on while wondering whether my name was on a list somewhere. I'll get into some of that today. Here's what I want to do in this episode. I want to look honestly at what this period of uncertainty actually does to people, psychologically, professionally, physically. Because if we pretend it doesn't affect us, we make worse decisions. Then I want to talk about what moves actually make sense during this window, not in a frantic, cover your faces way, but in a grounded, clear eyed way. And I want to close with something that's harder to talk about: what that moment is actually telling you if you're willing to listen. Let's get into it. What the waiting actually does to you. I want to start here because I think we skip too fast. We jump to the tactical, update your resume, talk to your network, and we treat the psychological weight of this experience as an obstacle to manage rather than something worth understanding. So let's be honest about what happens to a person who's in a threatened organization. The first thing that happens is what I call the cognitive tax. Your brain is now running two processes simultaneously. There's the job, the actual work, and then there's the surveillance, the constant low level scanning for information. Who got called into a meeting? Who's been quiet on Slack? Did that project just get deprioritized for a reason? Your memory, your working memory shrinks, your concentration narrows. Things that used to feel automatic start feeling like effort, and you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fully fix. This is real. It's not weakness. It's your nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do, maintaining a threat scan in parallel with everything else. The problem is your nervous system doesn't distinguish between a predator and a restructuring. The alert system is the same. The second thing that happens is what I call identity turbulence. And this one hits experienced professionals especially hard. When you've been doing this for a long time, when your career is genuinely a part of how you understand yourself, the threat of losing it isn't just a financial threat. It's a threat to the story you tell about who you are. I've had clients in their 50s and early 60s describe this feeling as disproportionate. I know I'm okay, I'll be okay, one person told me. I've been through harder things, but I feel like I'm disappearing. That's not melodrama, that's identity, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Third, the relational distortion. This is the one people don't talk about much, but it's real and it does damage. When you're waiting for a layoff, the way you relate to your colleagues shifts. You start wondering whose head is on the block. You start reading kindness as pity. You wonder if your manager knows something. You pull back from genuine collaboration because collaboration requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels dangerous right now. The result is that even before anything official happens, the team frays. Trust erodes. People retreat into individual survival mode, and the work suffers, which is maddening because the last thing you want to do when your job might be at risk is perform worse. Fourth, the physical toll. I want to be direct about this because professionals tend to minimize it. Chronic, low grade stress, the kind that comes from sustained uncertainty, affects sleep, appetite, immune function, and cardiovascular health. Over weeks and months, it accumulates. I've seen people reach a layoff, even one that ends with them keeping their job, and then completely crash physically in the week after. The body was holding more than they knew. Now, here's why I'm spending time on this. It's not to be grim, because if you don't understand what's happening to you, you're going to attribute it to personal failure. You're going to think you're handling this poorly, that stronger people don't feel this, that there's something wrong with your resilience. That self judgment makes everything worse. What's happening to you is completely normal human response to sustain uncertainty. The goal isn't to make the anxiety disappear. The goal is to understand it well enough that you can function inside of it. Here's a phrase I return to a lot in this work: name it to tame it. It's a piece of neuroscience shorthand. The idea that when you label an emotional state, the prefrontal cortex begins its regulation process. In plain language, when you can say, this is anxiety caused by sustained uncertainty, and here's specifically what's driving it, you gain some purchase on it. It doesn't dissolve, but it stops running the show completely. So before you do anything else, before the tactical moves, before the conversations, before the resumes, spend some time just being honest with yourself about what this is costing you, not to wallow, to orient. The moves that actually make sense. Let's talk about what to actually do. I want to be upfront about something first. There's a different genre of career advice that is designed to make people feel productive during this window. Update every platform, network like crazy, have 40 coffees, position, position, position. And there's value in some of that. But there's also a way that frantic activity can be a form of avoidance, staying so busy that you don't have to sit with the uncertainty. The frantic activity, when it comes from anxiety rather than strategy, tends to produce low quality output. You'll write a mediocre resume in a panic when you'd write a great one in a clear head 2 weeks later. So let me offer a framework. I think about it this way: two tracks running in parallel. Track one is stabilization, track two is preparation. Most people jump straight to track two and track one and skip track one entirely. That's a mistake. Track one stabilization means doing the things that keep you functional, grounded during a period of sustained stress. And I want to give some concrete things here, not abstractions. First, control what you can control. Make a list of things in your professional situation that are within your influence and things that aren't. Then deliberately stop spending mental energy on the things you can't control. Not because they don't matter, they clearly do, but because anxiety has a way of collapsing the distinction. When everything feels equally urgent and equally outside your control, you're paralyzed. When you've sorted the list, you can put your energy where it can actually do something. Second, protect your sleep. I know this sounds pedestrian, but I mean it seriously. Sleep deprivation compounds every other negative effect of this period. It impairs judgment, inflates emotional reactivity, makes you perceive threats as larger than they are. If you're laying awake at 2 a.m., running the same mental scenarios, that's information. That's your nervous system telling you it needs help. Consider what rituals, real ones, not scrolling your phone, help you actually downshift at the end of the day. This is not optional maintenance. This is operational. Third, find one person you can be honest with, not your team, not your manager, one person, a spouse, a trusted friend, a coach, a peer in a different organization with whom you can say exactly what you're feeling without managing the message. This is more important than it sounds. The effort of maintaining a game face at work is exhausting, and there is no relief valve. It comes out sideways when there's no relief valve. People get short with their families, disconnect from their kids, irritable in low stakes situations. Find the person who can hear the real version and let yourself say it. Fourth, keep showing up. I mean this in a specific way. There's a temptation during this period to go quiet, to do only what's asked, to stop contributing ideas, stop volunteering, stop taking initiative. Some of this is protective instinct. Why make yourself visible? It might attract attention. But this logic tends to backfire. People who go quiet in times of uncertainty appear to disengage. And disengagement is much easier, a disengaged person is much easier to put on a list than someone who is actively contributing. Show up, do the work, not out of false optimism. Do it because you have agency over how you're perceived and how you're perceived matters. Track two is preparation. Now for the parallel track. And I want to be clear, parallel, not sequential. Sequential. You don't stabilize first and then prepare. You do both at once at a pace that doesn't generate more anxiety than it manages. First, get honest about your financial picture, not catastrophizing, honest. How long could you go without income? Do you have 3 months? 6? Is there any flexibility to extend the runway? This isn't about assuming the worst. It's about knowing your actual threshold so that uncertainty doesn't have to do all the emotional work. When people don't know their number, when they've been avoiding looking at it, the fear tends to inflate past the actual reality. Look at the number. It's almost always less scary than not knowing. Second, update your materials while you have time, not in a panic, in a considered way. Your resume, your LinkedIn, your professional narrative, and specifically articulate what you've accomplished in this role during this period. Not just what you're responsible for. What did you actually move? What's different because you were there? This work is easier to do when you're still in the role and you have access to the data, the context, and some emotional stability. It gets harder and fuzzier the further you get away from it. Third, do a real assessment of your network, not a quantitative one, not how many LinkedIn connections you have, but a qualitative one. Who are the 10 people who, if you reached out today and said, I may be navigating a transition soon, would respond meaningfully and quickly? Are there people on that list you haven't talked to in a year? Start warming those relationships now, but do it genuinely. Catch up conversations, real interest in where they are, not, I may need something from you soon, but I've been thinking about you and wanted to reconnect. People can feel the difference, and the genuine version is a more effective way. Fourth, think about your narrative. If you do end up in transition, you'll be asked to explain what happened. This is worth thinking about before you're in the middle of it. There was a restructuring is fine as far as it goes, but experienced professionals need to be able to say more than that. What was the context? What were you doing at the organization when this happened? What's the work you want to do next? And why does it connect to what you built? Layoffs carry less stigma than they once did. Anyone in a hiring seat today has either been through one or knows people who have. But a clear, grounded narrative still matters. Start drafting it, not for a cover letter, just for yourself. One more thing on the preparation track that I want to be honest, that is one that is uncomfortable. Think about whether there are conversations you should be having with your leadership, not fishing for information, not cornering your manager and asking, am I on the list? That's not productive. But if there are meaningful conversations about your contributions, your value, and where you're positioned that you've been putting off, this is the time to have them. Not because it will necessarily change an outcome, but because it gives you more information and puts you into an active rather than a passive role. Waiting and watching is not the only option. The internal experience and what this moment is telling you. I want to go somewhere that career coaches don't always go because I think it's where the most important work of this period actually happens. Anxiety, layoff anxiety, the pending, unresolved kind, creates a specific kind of pressure. And like most high pressure situations, it has a way of surfacing things you might not have looked at in the ordinary flow of work about the job, about yourself, and what you actually want. I want to share something from my own experience here. There was a period in my career, and I won't get into specifics, where I was with an organization that was going through significant change, an acquisition by a large entity. The ground was shifting. There were signals, and I found myself during that period in a kind of a suspended state, doing the work, managing the anxiety, but also underneath it all, starting to notice something I hadn't paid much attention to before, which was how much of my energy in that role was going into things I didn't find particularly meaningful. Not that the work was bad, not that the organization was bad, but there was a gap between what I was good at, what I cared about, and what I was being asked to do. And I had been so busy managing the day to day that I never really stopped to sit with that. The uncertainty forced me to. Because when you're anxious about losing something, you have to get honest about whether you actually want it. I'm not going to pretend that that was a comfortable realization to have, but it was useful. It was a useful one. It changed the nature of my preparation. I wasn't just asking, how do I survive this? I was asking, where do I actually want to land? I think this is a question that's worth sitting on, and I want to be careful not to romanticize it. Some people are in this situation and they love their work, they love their organization, they simply want to stay. There's nothing wrong with that. But even for these people, the question of what the work actually means to them, what they what they would protect if they could, and what they would might quietly be relieved to leave behind is worth examining. Here's a specific prompt I give to coaching clients in this situation. Write two versions of a paragraph. The first version, the layoff doesn't happen. You stay. What does that mean for the next 2 years? Write it honestly, not the party line, not the best case, but your real considered version of what staying looks like. In the second version, the layoff happens, you leave involuntarily, but you leave. What is the first thing you do? What's the version of the next chapter that you might actually build? Most people find that one of those paragraphs is easier to write than the other, and that's information. I want to address something directly here because I've seen it enough that it deserves honest treatment. There are people who are in this situation who are afraid of losing a job, who, if they're being completely honest, haven't felt genuinely engaged in that work in some time, maybe even years. They've been doing it. They've been doing it well, and in many cases, but the thing that used to make them feel meaningful has quietly gone away, and they've adapted to the absence of it without ever naming it. The benefits are good. The routine is familiar. The identity, I work at X and I'm a Y, still holds, so they kept going. For those people, a pending layoff isn't just a threat, it's a reckoning. Because if the worst happens and they end up in transition, they're not just looking for a new job, they're looking for a reason to go to work that they maybe hadn't had in a while. And that's a different problem, harder and more important. I'm not saying the job loss would be fine. It wouldn't be. Involuntary transitions are disruptive and painful, regardless of how engaged you were. But if that's the actual situation, then the preparation work, the narrative work, the network work, the what do I actually want to do work has to be more fundamental than resume updates. What I'm saying underneath all of this, I'm saying that pending layoff anxiety is a signal, and signals carry information. The anxiety itself is telling you something is threatened. The question we're spending time on is, this is something you want to protect, or is this something you've been protecting out of habit? Those are different responses. When the fear is specifically about age, I wanted to get specific attention to this because it's rarely talked about directly, but it's front of mind for a lot of people in this audience. When you've been doing this for 20 or 30 years, when you're in your late 40s or 50s or beyond, pending layoff anxiety carries an additional layer because it's not just, I will lose this job. It's, if I lose this job, will I be able to find another one that's comparable? And sometimes it's even more pointed than that. Will anyone want me? I've had those conversations enough to know that they happen in private, in the car, on the way home, not in public. Because admitting that fear feels like admitting something you're not supposed to admit, weakness. or maybe irrelevance. Let me say this plainly. Ageism is in hiring is real. I'm not going to say telling you it isn't. I'm not going to tell you it isn't. The data is consistent and the experience people bring to me are consistent. Experienced professionals face a different search market than younger ones. The length of search is typically longer. The implicit biases in hiring systems, including AI-driven screenings, tend to disadvantage people whose careers don't pattern match to newer models. I've done an episode on this. We don't need to pretend it isn't true. I've also seen enough to know that catastrophizing isn't useful either, because the fear of age discrimination tends to get applied universally. And it isn't universal, it's specific. Some industries, some organizations, some roles, some cultures are significantly more resistant to experienced talent than others. And some are genuinely hungry for it, not because they're charitable, but because they've lost institutional knowledge. They need people who can lead without training, and they need fractional or interim capacity without the overhead of a full time hire. I'd like to encourage you to do this, you to do with this fear. What I'd like to encourage you to do with this fear is the same thing I'd encourage with broader anxiety. Be specific. What are you actually afraid of? Is it that your industry has become hostile or to experience? Is it a specific salary expectation you've carried that you're afraid the market won't support? Is it that your skills have a gap that you've been meaning to address? Whatever it is, get it out of the abstract and into the specific, because specific fears have specific responses. Abstract dread usually accumulates. And I'll say this, in 20 plus years of professional life and all the work I've done coaching experienced professionals, the single most consistent differentiator between the people who land well after a late career transition and the people who struggle is not age, not industry, not even skill. It's clarity. The people who are clear about what they offer, clear about where they want to contribute, and clear enough in the conversation to communicate both, they do significantly better. The people who show up hoping someone will connect the dots for them tend to struggle regardless of how good they are. You have to be willing to make the case for yourself, not aggressively, not by cataloging your credentials, but by having a clear, current answer to the question. Here's what I bring, and here's what it does for an organization like yours. If that's the work you need to do, and for many people, the pending layoff period is actually when they do it, then start doing it now. Let's close with what to carry out of this conversation. Let me pull this all together. Pending layoff anxiety is one of the most psychologically complex experiences a professional can navigate because it holds together things that don't easily coexist. The need to keep performing and the fear that it may not matter. The desire for certainty and the reality of no control. The instinct to protect, the question of whether what you're protecting is what you actually want. I've talked about today about what this period does to you physiologically and psychologically. And I've tried to be honest with the effects, that the effects are real and that they accumulate. I've offered a two-track frame, stabilization and preparation, as a way to function inside uncertainty without either collapsing into passivity or burning yourself out on frantic activity that doesn't help. I've tried to make space for the harder question underneath, the tactical one, which is what this moment is actually revealing about your relationship with your work. I want to close with one last thing. When I was going through my own version of this, that suspended, uncertain period I mentioned earlier, there was a night when I was sitting with the anxiety and I had a thought that I've come back to many times since. The thought was, I am more than this job, not in an aspirational poster sense, in a factual sense. My capacity, my experience, my judgment, my character, none of that is contingent upon whether this particular organization decides to need me. They can decide not to. That doesn't change what I've built. It doesn't change what I know how to do. It doesn't reach back and undo the work I've done or the people I've helped or the problems I've solved. That sounds simple, but in the middle of that anxiety, it was a genuinely grounding. It was genuinely grounding because anxiety, real sustained anxiety, has a way of making the threatened thing feel like the only thing, and it usually isn't. You're not on your org chart position. You're not your org chart position. You are the capability that you carry into every room you enter. Nobody can restructure that away. However, however this ends for you, whether the layoff happens or doesn't, whether you stay or go by choice or not by choice, you go with what you've built. And if you've been in this long enough to be in your 40s or 50s or beyond, you've built more than you may be giving yourself credit for right now. Do the work. If this episode was useful to you, share it with someone who's in this situation because they probably won't admit it, but they'll appreciate it. Next week, we'll be talking about the weight of the box, what to do when the layoff happens. This is Rich Jones. I hope to see you then.